Welcome, history lovers, to the very first chapter of our journey into the American past. We're turning back the clock to a pivotal moment, a time when a young nation stood on the cusp of a new century, filled with both uncertainty and boundless potential. The year is 1800. The United States of America, not even a quarter century old, is about to embark on a new era. Think about that for a moment. A new country, a new capital, and a new century, all converging at once. It was a time of incredible change and audacious dreams. The air was thick with anticipation. For the first decade of its existence, under the Constitution, the heart of the American government beat in two of its most vibrant cities. First, briefly, in New York, and then for 10 years in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the largest city in the nation, a center of commerce, culture, and intellectual fire. It was where the Declaration of Independence was signed and the Constitution was debated. It was, for all intents and purposes, the cradle of the Republic. But the founders had a different vision for their nation's capital. They dreamed of a city that belonged not to any single state, but to all the people. A federal district, a neutral ground, where the business of the nation could be conducted without the influence of any one state's interests. And so, in the summer of 1800, the Great Migration began. A fleet of ships sailed from the bustling ports of Philadelphia, carrying the entire archives of the U.S. government. Crates filled with priceless documents, ledgers, and the records of a fledgling nation were loaded onto sloops and sent down the Delaware River, out into the Atlantic, and up the Potomac. On land, wagons rumbled over rough-hewn roads, carrying furniture, supplies, and the families of government clerks and officials, all heading towards a destination that was more of an idea than a reality. They were leaving the familiar cobblestone streets and established society of Philadelphia for a wilderness, a construction site carved out of the Maryland and Virginia countryside. This wasn't just a move, it was a profound statement of intent. The nation was literally building its future from the ground up. They arrived in a place that must have felt like the edge of the known world. This new federal city, named in honor of the nation's revolutionary hero, George Washington, was a far cry from the sophisticated metropolis of Philadelphia. Instead of paved streets, there were muddy tracks. Instead of grand halls, there were half-finished buildings scattered across a sprawling, swampy landscape. The city was a blueprint, a grand plan on paper designed by Pierre L'Enfant, but the reality was a patchwork of construction sites, forests, and fields. The entire population of this new city was just a few thousand people. It was a bold, and to some, a foolish gamble. Could a nation truly be governed from a place that barely existed? At the very heart of this burgeoning capital, another symbol of the nation's aspirations was slowly taking shape: the President's House. We know it today as the White House, a global icon of power and democracy. But in 1800, it was an unfinished shell. The sandstone walls were up, but much of the interior was a maze of scaffolding and raw lumber. The grand staircase hadn't been built yet. Plasterers and carpenters worked frantically to make at least a portion of it habitable for its first resident. The building was stark, imposing, and incomplete, a perfect metaphor for the United States itself. It was a grand structure filled with the promise of what it could become, a testament to the nation's ambition, yet still a work in progress, vulnerable and exposed. In November of 1800, the second president of the United States, John Adams, became the first to occupy this new executive mansion. He arrived in a city that was more of a swampy village than a capital. The journey itself was arduous. He reportedly got lost in the woods for hours, just trying to find his way. When he finally moved in, the house was damp, cold, and cavernous. Only a handful of rooms were plastered, and large fires had to be kept burning in every hearth just to dry the wet walls and ward off the chill. His wife, the formidable First Lady Abigail Adams, arrived a few weeks later and famously hung the presidential laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room, the very space that would one day host elegant state dinners and historic ceremonies. In a letter to Abigail, John Adams penned a prayer that has since been carved into the mantel of the state dining room. He wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." These words, written from a cold, unfinished house in a raw, new city, echo through the centuries. They captured the profound sense of hope and the heavy burden of responsibility that defined this era. The founders weren't just building a city. They were trying to build a new kind of nation, one founded on ideals of liberty and self-governance. The unfinished White House stood as a physical embodiment of that project, grand in its conception, but with a future that was far from certain. At the same time, just over a mile away, another monumental structure was rising. The Capitol building, like the president's house, it was also a work in progress. When Congress convened there for the first time in November 1800, only one wing, the North Wing, was complete. The Senate, the House of Representatives, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court were all crammed into this single building. Lawmakers debated the future of the country in rooms where the plaster was still damp. The grandeur of the Capitol we see today was just a distant dream, but the very act of gathering in this unfinished hall, in this half-built city, was a powerful act of faith. It was a declaration that this American experiment, Tias Republic, was here to stay. The year 1800 wasn't just about moving buildings and archives. It was a year of immense political turmoil that would test the very foundations of the young republic. The presidential election of 1800 was one of the most bitter and contentious in American history. It pitted the incumbent Federalist, John Adams, against his own vice president, the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. It was a campaign filled with personal attacks, partisan fury, and genuine fears that the nation could be torn apart by political division. The election ultimately resulted in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. 4 weeks, the nation held its breath as the House voted again and again, deadlocked. It was a constitutional crisis, a moment when the peaceful transfer of power, something we take for granted today, was anything but guaranteed. Finally, on the 36th ballot, Jefferson was elected president. This event, often called the Revolution of 1800, marked the first time in modern history that power was peacefully transferred from one political party to its opposition. It was a triumph for the American system of government. It proved that the nation could survive intense political conflict without resorting to violence or collapse. In his inaugural address in March 1801, delivered in the still incomplete Senate chamber, Thomas Jefferson sought to heal the nation's wounds. He famously declared, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He called for unity and a return to the core principles of the Revolution. His inauguration, the first to be held in the new capital of Washington, D.C., symbolized a new beginning. So, as the 19th century dawned, the United States stood at a crossroads. Its government was housed in a raw, unfinished city, a bold gamble on a national future. Its political system had just survived a severe test, proving its resilience. The nation was expanding, its population was growing, and its people were filled with a restless energy and an unshakable belief in their own destiny. The move to Washington, D.C., the unfinished White House, the contentious election of 1800, all of these were more than just historical events. They were the crucible in which the character of a new nation was forged. It was a nation built on hope, defined by struggle, and forever reaching for the ideals upon which it was founded. This was America's new beginning, and the story of the 19th century was just getting started. Thank you so much for joining us on this first step of our journey. It's a fascinating period, and we've only just scratched the surface. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. We've so much more to explore together. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the architects of America. Today, we delve into the life of a man often overshadowed by his contemporaries, yet whose intellect and integrity were indispensable to the young nation. John Adams. This is the story of the reluctant leader. Before he was president, before he was even a name whispered in the halls of power, John Adams was a lawyer from Massachusetts, a brilliant, sometimes cantankerous, but fiercely principled man. He believed in the rule of law so strongly that he famously defended the British soldiers accused in the Boston Massacre, ensuring they received a fair trial. It was an unpopular, even dangerous, decision, but for Adams, justice was not a matter of convenience. This single act tells you everything you need to know about his character. He was a patriot, but his patriotism was rooted in ideals, not blind fervor. As the revolutionary flame ignited across the colonies, Adams was at the forefront. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, A tireless advocate for independence, while others gave rousing speeches, Adams did the hard, often tedious work behind the scenes. He was a member of the Committee of Five, tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence. While Jefferson was the primary author, it was Adams who championed the document, arguing passionately for its adoption. He called it the greatest question which ever was debated in America, and he put his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor on the line to see it through. During the Revolutionary War, Adams's service shifted from the legislative floor to the courts of Europe. As a diplomat, his mission was critical: to secure financial and military support for the fledgling United States. He traveled to France and the Netherlands, a world away from his beloved Braintree farm and his dear wife, Abigail. Their correspondence during these years is one of the most remarkable in American history, revealing not just the political struggles of the time, but the deep personal sacrifices they both made for the cause of liberty. His diplomatic efforts were crucial, securing loans and recognition that helped turn the tide of the war. When the war was won and the Constitution established, a new government was formed. George Washington was the unanimous choice for the first president, and John Adams became his vice president. Adams described the vice presidency as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. For 8 years, he served in Washington's shadow, presiding over the Senate and offering counsel. It was a frustrating role for a man of his intellect and ambition, yet he performed his duties with diligence. He provided a steady hand, helping to shape the protocols and traditions of the new government, all while navigating the treacherous political waters of the emerging two-party system. In 1796, the nation faced its first truly contested presidential election. Washington stepped down, and the mantle of leadership was up for grabs. John Adams, the Federalist candidate, narrowly defeated his friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson, and so Adams stepped out of the shadow and into the presidency. But the spotlight was harsh. He inherited a nation on the brink of war with France, a deeply divided cabinet, many of whom were more loyal to his rival Alexander Hamilton than to him, and a press that was ruthless and partisan. The presidency for Adams was not a glorious coronation. It was a quiet, heavy burden. He was not a charismatic military hero like Washington or a visionary philosopher like Jefferson. He was a pragmatist, a statesman who sought to steer the ship of state through a storm. His greatest achievement as president was also his most controversial. He kept the United States out of a full-scale war with France. Through careful diplomacy and against the wishes of many in his own party, he negotiated a peaceful resolution. This act of political courage likely cost him his re-election, but he believed it saved the young republic from a potentially disastrous conflict it could not afford. His presidency was also marked by the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, laws passed in response to the perceived threat from France. These acts restricted immigration and criminalized criticism of the government, a clear contradiction of the revolutionary ideals Adams had fought for. While he didn't write the laws, he did sign them. A decision that has stained his legacy and served as a stark warning about the tension between national security and individual liberty. It was a complex time, and Adams made decisions that were, and still are, fiercely debated. After one tumultuous term, Adams lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. He became the first one-term president, leaving the capital quietly before his successor's inauguration. He returned to his farm, Peacefield, not as a defeated politician, but as a citizen returning home. For the next quarter century, he lived a life of reading, writing, and reflection. He reconciled with his old friend and rival, Jefferson, and their ensuing correspondence is a treasure of American thought. As they debated philosophy, religion, and the future of the nation they had both helped to create. John Adams's story is not one of easy victories or universal acclaim. It's the story of a man who was often prickly, stubborn, and unpopular, but who possessed an unwavering commitment to the American experiment. He was a leader not because he craved power, but because he felt a profound sense of duty. He willingly shouldered the burdens of leadership, making difficult choices that he believed were in the best interest of the nation, even when they were to his own detriment. In a final, poignant twist of fate, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the very same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was unaware that his friend had passed away just hours earlier. It was a fitting end for two giants who, despite their differences, had dedicated their lives to the same great cause. John Adams, the reluctant leader, the unappreciated president, left behind a legacy of integrity, courage, and steadfast service. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the life of John Adams. If you found the story as fascinating as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to see us cover next. Until then, stay curious. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Last time, we explored the early days of the American Republic. Today, in Chapter 3, we're diving into the fascinating story of how the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., came to be. It's a tale of political compromise, grand ambition, and a vision for a city that would represent the ideals of a new nation. So, after the Revolutionary War, the United States didn't have a permanent capital. The government was a bit of a rolling stone, meeting in various cities like Philadelphia, New York, and this wasn't just inconvenient. It was a real problem. Imagine trying to run a country when your government offices are constantly packing and unpacking. The leaders of the time, especially President George Washington, knew this couldn't last. They needed a permanent, central location for the federal government plays that belonged not to any single state, but to all the people of the United States. This idea sparked one of the earliest and most intense debates in American politics. The northern states, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, wanted the capital to remain in the north, close to the centers of finance and commerce. The southern states, represented by leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, argued for a location further south, more accessible to their agricultural economies. The debate was fierce, and it became tangled with another major issue: the national debt. Hamilton had a plan for the federal government to assume the state's war debts, a move many southern states opposed because they had already paid off most of theirs. The solution came in a legendary backroom deal, often called the Compromise of 1790. It said that Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison met over dinner and hammered out an agreement. The Southerners would vote for Hamilton's debt plan, and in return, the Northerners would agree to locate the new capital city on the banks of the Potomac River, a location favored by George Washington himself. This was a masterstroke of political negotiation. The deal not only resolved to critical issues, but also set the stage for the creation of a brand new federal city, carved out of land donated by Maryland and Virginia. The choice of the Potomac River region was no accident. It was a strategic and symbolic location. Geographically, it sat right in the middle of the original 13 states. A perfect compromise between North and South. For George Washington, it was also personal. His beloved Mount Vernon estate was just down the river. He envisioned a capital that would become a hub of commerce and national life, connected to the western frontier through the Potomac. The Residence Act of 1790 made it official. A 10-mile square district would be established as the permanent seat of the U.S. government. With the location set, the next monumental task was designing the city itself. This wasn't going to be just any town. It was meant to be a grand capital, a physical embodiment of the Republic's power and democratic ideals. For this ambitious project, Washington turned to a brilliant, but famously stubborn, French-American military engineer who had served with him during the Revolution. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant had written to Washington, expressing his desire to design a capital magnificent enough to grace a great nation. Washington was impressed by his passion and his vision. L'Enfant didn't think small. He envisioned a city unlike any other in America at the time. Inspired by the great European capitals, particularly Paris and Versailles, he planned a city with wide avenues, public squares, and dramatic vistas. His design was based on a grid system of streets, but overlaid with broad, diagonal avenues that would intersect at circles and plazas. This wasn't just for aesthetics. These avenues were designed to connect key federal buildings, creating symbolic lines of sight and making navigation through the city both practical and visually stunning. At the heart of L'Enfant's plan were two key buildings: the Congress House, which we now know as the U.S. Capitol Building, and the President's House, today's White House. He placed the Capitol on what was then called Jenkins Hill, which he described as a pedestal waiting for a monument. From this high ground, a grand avenue, now Pennsylvania Avenue, would connect it directly to the president's house, symbolizing the connection and balance between the legislative and executive branches of government. A vast public mall, a grand avenue stretching westward from the Capitol, was planned as a space for public recreation and national celebrations. L'Enfant's vision was incredibly detailed and forward-thinking. He planned for canals, public fountains, monuments, and parks. He saw the city not just as a collection of government buildings, but as a living, breathing, urban space that would inspire patriotism and civic pride for generations to come. He was designing for the ages, anticipating a nation that would grow in size and stature. However, his uncompromising nature and his tendency to clash with the commissioners appointed to oversee the project ultimately led to his dismissal. He refused to compromise his vision, even when it meant defying the city's planners and landowners. Despite his unceremonious departure, L'Enfant's foundational plan was so powerful and so brilliant that it largely survived. The commissioners hired surveyor Andrew Ellicott and his assistant, Benjamin Banneker, a remarkable free African-American astronomer and mathematician, to continue the work. Using L'Enfant's original drawings, which they had to reconstruct from memory after L'Enfant left with his copies, they finalized the survey and layout of the city. So, while L'Enfant never received the credit he deserved during his lifetime, the magnificent city of Washington, D.C. that we see today is, in large part, a testament to his original, audacious vision. And so, from a political stalemate and a dinner-table compromise, the idea for a national capital was born. It was placed on the Potomac as a bridge between North and South, and designed by a visionary Frenchman to be a symbol of a nation's highest aspirations. The birth of Washington, D.C. is a story of how a young country dared to dream big, planning a capital not just for its present, but for its future greatness. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope you found the story of Washington, D.C.'s creation as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through the history of the White House. Last time, we explored the decision to place the nation's capital on the banks of the Potomac. Today, in Chapter 4, we redive into the construction of the building that would become its centerpiece. The president, after settling on the location for the new federal city, the next big question was, what would the president's home actually look like? This wasn't just about building a house. It was about creating a symbol for a brand new republic. So, in 1792, a competition was announced, inviting the finest architects in the country to submit their designs. The call was for a residence that was grand, but not gaudy, dignified but not It had to project power and permanence without looking like the palaces of the European monarchies. The nation had just fought to escape. 9 proposals were submitted. Imagine being on that selection committee, poring over these blueprints for the future. One submission even came from an anonymous entrant, who turned out to be none other than Thomas Jefferson himself. He proposed a grand villa with a dome, inspired by classical Roman architecture. But ultimately, the commission, with President George Washington's approval, chose a different vision. The winning design belonged to an Irish-born architect named James Hoban. His concept was a stunning example of neoclassical architecture, drawing inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin and other grand European estates. It was elegant, symmetrical, and perfectly balanced. It featured a 3-story stone facade, graceful columns, and a sense of refined authority. Hoban's design struck the perfect chord. It was presidential. It looked like it belonged to a leader, not a king. Washington saw in it the ideal blend of dignity and Republican simplicity. With the design approved, it was time to build. On October 13, 1792, the cornerstone was laid, and construction officially began. But building a structure of this magnitude in a fledgling city, carved out of swampland and forests, was no easy task. From the very beginning, the project was plagued by challenges. First, there was the matter of materials. The beautiful, pale gray sandstone that would give the mansion its distinctive look had to be quarried from Aquia Creek, Virginia, about 40 miles down the Potomac River. Getting these massive stone blocks from the quarry to the construction site was a monumental logistical puzzle. They were loaded onto boats, floated up the river, and then hauled overland by laborers. It was slow, backbreaking work. Then came the issue of labor itself. Washington, D.C. was not yet a bustling metropolis with a large pool of skilled craftsmen. The commissioners had to recruit stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans from far and wide. Many skilled workers were brought over from Scotland. The project also relied heavily on the labor of both free and enslaved African Americans, who were involved in every stage of construction, from quarrying the stone to sawing the timber and firing the bricks. Their contributions were absolutely essential, a difficult but crucial part of this story that often goes untold. As the walls slowly began to rise, another problem emerged. Money, or rather, a lack of it. The project was constantly over budget. Congress was hesitant to allocate more funds, and the construction process frequently stalled as the commissioners scrambled to find the money to pay for materials and wages. Letters from the time are filled with frantic pleas for more cash to keep the work going. Despite the slow pace and soaring costs, progress, inch by inch, was being made. Under Hoban's direct supervision, the stone walls were meticulously erected. The interior structure, built with timber from the forests of North Carolina and Virginia, began to take shape. The sheer scale of the building was awe-inspiring to anyone who saw it. It was, by a huge margin, the largest residence in the United States. Years passed, 1793, 94, 95. The sandstone shell of the president's house stood, but the interior was far from finished. The roof was finally put on in 1797. Plasterers, painters, and cabinet makers started the long and detailed process of finishing the grand rooms. But as the 18th century drew to a close, the house was still an active construction site. In fact, when President John Adams and his wife, Abigail, became the first residents in November of 18, the house was still largely unfinished. Plaster was still wet on the walls, and some rooms were completely empty. Abigail Adams famously wrote letters describing the state of the house, complaining about the damp and the cold, and how she had to hang her laundry to dry in the great, unfinished East Room. It was a rough, uncomfortable start for the first family in their new home. So, the president's house was born not in a flash of glory, but through a long, difficult, and expensive process. It was a testament to the perseverance and ambition of the young nation. It was built with stone from Virginia, timber from the Carolinas, and the sweat and skill of people from all walks of life, including immigrants and the enslaved. This massive, unfinished stone building standing in the middle of a muddy, half-built city was more than just a house. It was a symbol of a government and a nation that was itself still under construction. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is far from over. Next time, we'll see how this unfinished house is transformed into a home, and how it faces its first great trial by fire. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next part of our story. We'll see you then. Imagine, if you will, a vast expanse of untamed American wilderness. Towering forests stretch as far as the eye can see, their ancient trees draped in thick vines. Murky swamps bubble with unseen life, their damp air thick with the buzz of insects. This isn't some forgotten frontier. This is the heart of a brand new nation. And right here, in the middle of all this raw, rugged nature, a monumental dream is taking shape, stone by heavy stone. This is the story of a house, but not just any house. This is the story of the president's house, rising from the mud and wilderness of what would one day be Washington, D.C. Welcome back to our journey through the birth of the White House. In our last chapter, we saw the ambitious plans laid out, a grand vision for a capital city and its presidential palace. But plans on paper are one thing. The reality on the ground was something else entirely. As the 18th century drew to a close, the site chosen for this magnificent building was little more than a construction zone carved out of the forest. The nearest town, Georgetown, was a bumpy, muddy ride-away. For the men tasked with building this national symbol, it must have felt like being posted to the edge of the world. Their task was monumental. They weren't just building a house. They were creating an icon from scratch, in an environment that fought them every step of the way. The design, chosen by George Washington himself, was elegant and ambitious, inspired by the grand country estates of Europe. It was meant to project strength, stability, and the refined ideals of the new republic. But bringing this neoclassical vision to life required immense labor and resources, both of which were in short supply. The cornerstone was laid in 1792 with great Masonic ceremony and hope. But after the dignitaries left, the real work began, and it was a slow, grilling slog. The primary material was Aquia Creek sandstone, a pale, porous stone that had to be quarried miles down the Potomac River. Getting this stone from the quarry to the construction site was a massive logistical challenge. Barges, often leaky and unreliable, would haul the heavy blocks up the river. From the riverbank, teams of oxen strained to drag the carts through thick mud and over rough-hewn roads to the building site. Every single block of stone represented a colossal effort. The workforce was a diverse mix of people, each with their own story. There were skilled stonemasons, many of them immigrants from Scotland, who brought their craft and expertise from the old world. Their job was to meticulously carve and shape each block of sandstone, ensuring a perfect fit. Imagine the sound echoing through the trees, the constant chip, chip, chip of hammers and chisels against stone, a rhythmic pulse of creation in the wilderness. These men were artists, and their canvas was the very foundation of the president's house. Alongside them were local laborers, both free and enslaved African Americans, who performed the back-breaking work of digging foundations, mixing mortar and hoisting the heavy materials. The conditions were brutal. Summers in the Potomac Valley were notoriously hot and humid, a breeding ground for malaria-carrying mosquitoes rising from the nearby swamps. Workers toiled under the oppressive sun, their bodies slick with sweat, constantly battling fatigue and the threat of disease. Winters were no better, bringing biting winds and freezing temperatures that made handling cold stone a painful, finger-numbing ordeal. Progress was painfully slow. Funding from a young, financially strapped Congress was inconsistent. Sometimes, the money would dry up completely, and work would grind to a halt. The commissioners overseeing the project constantly wrote desperate letters, pleading for funds to pay the workers and buy materials. There were weeks, even months, where the site fell silent, the half-finished walls standing like ancient ruins, a stark monument to stalled ambition. For the workers, this meant uncertainty. They had families to feed, and the inconsistent pay made life incredibly difficult. And what about the city that was supposed to surround this grand mansion? Well, city was a generous term. The grand avenues and public squares envisioned by planner Pierre L'Enfant were, at Tees Point, mostly lines drawn on a map. In reality, there were muddy tracks cutting through forests and farmland. A few boarding houses, taverns, and crude huts had sprung up to house the workers and a handful of government clerks, but it was far from a bustling metropolis. Foreign diplomats arriving at the time were famously unimpressed, describing Washington as a city of magnificent distances, or less charitably, a mood hole. You could literally stand at the side of the president's house and see nothing but trees, swamps, and the distant shimmeroo of the Potomac River. It was a capital city in name only, a raw and unfinished promise. Despite all these challenges, the harsh environment, the grueling labor, the inconsistent funding, the sheer isolation, the walls of the president's house continued to rise. Slowly but surely, the structure began to resemble the elegant building from the plans. Each window arch that was completed, each column that was set in place, was a small victory against the wilderness. It was a testament to the incredible resilience and determination of the men who were building it. They were working in conditions we can hardly imagine today, driven by a paycheck. Yes, but also, perhaps, by a sense of being part of something historic, something that would outlast them all. By 1800, after 8 long years of construction, the house was still not entirely finished, but it was habitable. The roof was on, the windows were glazed, and the main structure was complete. It stood stark and white against the green landscape, a beacon of civilization in the wild. Its sandstone walls, not yet painted the iconic white we know today, had a pale, ghostly appearance. It wasn't a palace yet, but it was a house, a very large, very important house, standing alone, waiting for its first resident. The story of this construction is a powerful reminder that great things are rarely built with ease. The White House we see today, so polished, so perfect, the ultimate symbol of American power, was born from struggle, sweat, and sheer grit. It rose not in a pristine, manicured city, but in a swampy wilderness, built by the hands of ordinary people, performing extraordinary work under the most difficult of circumstances. Their legacy is not just in the stones of the building itself, but in the spirit of perseverance that it represents. They didn't just build a house. They laid the foundation for a capital and helped solidify the identity of a nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our story. It's a part of the White House's history that is often overlooked, but it's essential to understanding its true origins. If you found this fascinating, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We've got more amazing stories to tell as we continue our journey. We'll see you in the next chapter, where the first president finally moves in. Thanks for watching. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, in Chapter 6, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in early American history. The great government migration from the bustling city of Philadelphia to a swampy, unfinished town on the Potomac River. This new place was called Washington. Imagine this. It's the year 1800. For 10 years, Philadelphia had served as the temporary capital of the United States. It was the nation's largest city, a center of culture, finance, and political debate. The Liberty Bell had rung there, the Declaration of Independence was signed there, and the Constitution was framed within its halls. It felt like the natural heart of the young republic. But the plan was always to move. A new, permanent federal city was being carved out of the wilderness, a district that belonged to no single state, but to all the people. The Residence Act of 1790 had decreed that by the first Monday of December 18, the federal government would officially reside in this new capital. As the deadline approached, a sense of uncertainty hung in the air. This new city, Washington, was far from ready. It was a chaotic construction site, with muddy roads, half-finished buildings, and vast open spaces. Many questioned the wisdom of leaving a sophisticated city like Philadelphia for what felt like the frontier. In the midst of this, President John Adams made a decisive and deeply symbolic choice. He resolved to move into the new president's house, not in December as required, but a month earlier, in November 1800. Why the rush? Adams understood the power of symbols. The very idea of a permanent capital was still fragile. Political divisions were deep, and there were whispers and plots to keep the government in Philadelphia or move it elsewhere. By moving early, Adams was planting a flag, both literally and figuratively. He was sending a clear message. This is our home now. There is no turning back. The federal city is a reality. So, in the autumn of 1800, the Great Migration began. It was a logistical spectacle. Government archives, records, furniture, and the personal belongings of hundreds of officials and clerks were packed into wagons and loaded onto ships for the journey south. Think about the sheer volume of paper treaties, laws, correspondences, all trundling down bumpy roads or sailing down the coast. This wasn't just a move of people and things, it was the transfer of the nation's memory and its administrative soul. The journey itself was an ordeal. Roads were poor, and the trip could take days, even weeks. For those arriving in Washington, the scene was a shock. The city was a patchwork of grand ambition and raw, unfinished reality. The Capitol building was only partially complete, with just its north wing finished. The president's house, not yet called the White House, was large and imposing, but it felt cold and damp. The plaster was still wet, and basic amenities were lacking. Abigail Adams famously hung her laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room. Scattered around these two monumental buildings were a few boarding houses, taverns, and the modest homes of laborers and speculators. There were no paved streets, no sidewalks to speak of. After a rain, the city's grand avenues turned into impassable rivers of mud. It was a far cry from the sophisticated urban life of Philadelphia. One congressman famously called it a city of magnificent distances, a sarcastic nod to the vast, empty spaces between the few completed structures. It felt less like a capital and more like a remote outpost. Many of the government workers and politicians who made the move were miserable. They missed the comforts, the social life, and the intellectual stimulation of Philadelphia. They complained about the crude living conditions, the isolation, and the mosquitoes that swarmed up from the nearby swamps. There was a real danger that morale would collapse. that the entire experiment of a new capital would fail before it even truly began. This is where the significance of Adams's early arrival becomes so clear. His presence in that damp, unfinished mansion was a stabilizing force. It was an act of leadership that went beyond issuing decrees. By enduring the hardships alongside everyone else, he demonstrated an unwavering commitment to the vision of Washington, D.C. He was determined to make it work. On his second night in the president's house, he wrote a letter to Abigail, concluding with a prayer that has since been inscribed on the mantelpiece in the state dining room. He wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." It was a moment of profound hope and dedication, penned amidst the discomfort and uncertainty. Adams wasn't just moving his administration. He was consecrating a new home for the American presidency and, by extension, for the American government. The move was a gamble, a leap of faith into a future that was far from certain. Leaving the established comfort of Philadelphia for a construction site on the Potomac was a bold statement about the kind of nation America intended to be a nation, building its own identity from the ground up, on neutral territory, beholden to no single state's influence. It was a physical manifestation of the motto E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. This relocation permanently shifted the nation's center of gravity southward and cemented the compromise that had created the capital in the first place. It was a difficult, messy, and uncomfortable transition, but it was absolutely essential. Without the determination of figures like Adams and the perseverance of those first government residents, the magnificent capital we know today might have remained just a dream on a surveyor's map. The move was the moment the blueprint for Washington, D.C. truly began to come to life. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our story. It's a powerful reminder that building a nation is often a messy and challenging business. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you as part of our history community. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7. The Journey South, a pivotal moment in the lives of John and Abigail Adams, and a powerful metaphor for the fledgling United States. So, grab your cup of tea, settle in, and let's travel back in time. Imagine leaving the familiar comforts of home, the polished society of Quincy, Mass, for an arduous journey into the unknown. This was the reality for John and Abigail in the fall of 1800. John, now president, and Abigail, the first lady, were moving to the nation's new, unfinished capital. Their journey wasn't on paved highways. It was a grueling trek through a landscape that was as wild and untamed as the new republic itself. The roads were a nightmare. Think deep, thick mud that could swallow a carriage wheel whole. Recent rains had turned the paths into treacherous mires, forcing their carriage to crawl at a snail's pace. At times, the mud was so bad they had to get out and walk, their fine shoes sinking into the muck. This wasn't just a difficult trip. It was a physical struggle against the very earth they sought to govern. This journey perfectly mirrors America's own growing pains. The nation was young, barely a couple of decades old. It was still finding its footing, navigating the messy, uncertain path of self-governance. Just like the Adamses' carriage fighting through the mud, America was forging its way forward, step by painstaking step. The journey was hard, it was uncertain, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of hope, a belief in the destination. They traveled for weeks, through dense forests and sparsely populated lands. There were moments of profound beauty, the vibrant colors of autumn painting the landscape, a reminder of the natural splendor of their vast country. But there were also moments of real danger and deep frustration. Getting lost was a constant threat. In one instance, they wandered 4 hours in a dense wood, the path completely disappearing. A terrifying experience that highlighted just how isolated they were. Abigail's letters from this time are a treasure. She describes the journey with her characteristic wit and resilience. She wrote about the primitive conditions of the inns where they stayed, often little more than rough cabins offering meager food and questionable lodging. Yet, she never lost her spirit. Her writings reveal a woman of incredible fortitude, whose personal discomfort was overshadowed by her unwavering commitment to her husband and her country. She saw this difficult journey as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of establishing a permanent seat of government. This trip was more than just a physical move. It was a symbolic pilgrimage. The capital was being moved from the established, sophisticated city of Philadelphia to a new, purpose-built city on the banks of the Potomac. This move was controversial. Many saw it as a foolish venture, abandoning a center of culture and commerce for a swampy, undeveloped wilderness. The journey south was, in a way, a journey into the heart of this controversy, a testament to the Adamses' belief in the federal project. And then, after weeks of hardship, they arrived. Their first glimpse of the new capital, Washington, was not of a grand, majestic city. It was a shock. What they saw was a construction site on a massive scale. Instead of paved avenues and stately buildings, they found a scattering of unfinished structures connected by muddy tracks. The president's house, what we now call the White House, was far from complete. It was large and imposing, but the grounds were a mess of debris, and the interior was damp, cold, and barely habitable. Abigail famously wrote that it was a castle in the wilderness. The main staircase wasn't even built yet. The rooms were cavernous and unfurnished. With the plaster still wet, they had to keep fires burning in all the hearths, just to make it bearable. And in one of the most iconic details of early American history, Abigail used the grand, unfinished East Room intended for lavish receptions as a place to hang the family's laundry to dry. This image is so powerful. The First Lady, hanging wet clothes in the grandest room of the president's house, perfectly encapsulates the reality of the situation. It was a blend of the grand and the humble, the aspirational and the practical. It speaks volumes about the character of the Adamses and the state of the nation. They were building a republic from the ground up, and they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty or to hang their laundry where they could. Their arrival wasn't a triumphant entry into a gleaming capital. It was a move into a work in progress, a raw, unfinished symbol of a raw, unfinished nation. The city of Washington was a gamble, a bold bet on the future, and John and Abigail Adams were its first official residents, living amidst the chaos and the construction. Their own lives mirroring the nation's struggle to turn a bold vision into a lasting reality. This chapter of their lives is a profound lesson in perseverance. It teaches us that great things are rarely built with ease. They require struggle, sacrifice, and a willingness to live in the messy in-between, with faith in what is to come. The muddy roads, the unfinished house, the laundry in the East Room, these are not just historical footnotes. They are symbols of the resilience and practical idealism that defined the founding generation. They saw not just the mud and the mess, but the promise of the magnificent capital and the enduring republic that would one day rise from it. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey south. It's a story that truly brings history to life, reminding us of the human-scale struggles behind the grand narrative of America. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Have you ever moved into a new place and found it, well, a bit of a fixer-upper? Imagine that, but your new place is the White House. This was the reality for America's second president, John Adams. In November of 1800, he wasn't greeted by a grand, pristine mansion, but by a construction site. As he stepped inside, the chill of late autumn wasn't just outside. The air inside was damp and cold, heavy with the sharp scent of wet plaster. Walls were still unfinished, some just bare brick and mortar. Floors were rough, unpolished wood, and most of the 36 rooms were completely empty. Cavernous spaces where every footstep echoed. There was no grand staircase yet, just a temporary wooden one. This wasn't the majestic residence we know today. It was a shell, a promise of what was to come. Imagine the Sinalone Figuri, the President of the United States, walking through these vast, ghostly rooms. Servants hurried to light fires in the few completed hearths, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the unfinished walls. The warmth was a small comfort against the dampness that seemed to seep from the very stones of the building. Abigail, his wife, hadn't even arrived yet. She was still back in Massachusetts, leaving Adams to face this stark new reality alone. He wrote to her, describing the house as habitable but far from comfortable. He noted the grand scale, calling it big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain. But the grandeur was lost in the emptiness. There was no running water, of course. Water had to be carted from a spring nearly a mile away. The surrounding landscape wasn't manicured lawns, but a muddy, cluttered construction yard littered with sheds, tools, and piles of materials. It's easy to picture a sense of disappointment, maybe even a bit of frustration. Here he was, the leader of a young nation, living in what amounted to a glorified and very cold work in progress. But that's not the whole story. As Adams stood in that echoing, half-finished hole, something else was present alongside the cold and the smell of plaster. A profound sense of pride. He knew he was standing at the very beginning of something monumental. He was the very first president to call this building home. Every president after him, every major decision, every piece of history that would unfold within these walls would follow his first, lonely footsteps. This wasn't just a house, it was a symbol, taking shape right before his eyes. He understood the significance of this moment. This structure, rising from the mud and chaos, was a physical manifestation of the nation itself, young, ambitious, and still very much under construction. It was imperfect, it was challenging, but it was theirs. It was the president's house, a permanent home for the leader of their republic. In a letter to Abigail, penned in one of those cold, firelit rooms, he wrote a prayer that has since become legendary. He wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." These words, later carved into the mantel of the state dining room by Franklin D. Roosevelt, captured that feeling perfectly. It wasn't about the lack of furniture or the damp walls. It was about the future, the legacy, the hope for the nation that this house represented. So while the fires crackled, fighting a losing battle against the November chill, John Adams wasn't just keeping warm. He was inaugurating a tradition. He was planting a flag, not in soil, but in the heart of a home that would become the heart of the nation. He saw past the bare floors and incomplete walls to the centuries of history that would echo in those halls. He was the first resident of the White House, and in that cold, empty building, he felt the immense weight and the incredible honor of being the first to call it home. It's a powerful reminder that great things often have humble, imperfect beginnings. The story of the White House doesn't start with polished marble and grand balls, but with one man in an empty room, with a fire for warmth and a prayer for the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this glimpse into history, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. We love exploring the lesser-known moments that shaped our world. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the history of America's most famous residents. Last time, we saw John Adams become the first president to move into the still unfinished White House. But a house isn't truly a home until the whole family is there. Today, we're exploring the arrival of one of history's most remarkable first ladies, Abigail Adams. In November of 1800, after a long and difficult journey from Massachusetts, Abigail Adams finally joined her husband in Washington. The city itself was a sprawling, muddy construction site with grand ambitions, but a very rustic reality. And the president's house, as it was then known, was no different. It was huge, cold, and far from finished. Abigail, a famously sharp-witted and pragmatic woman, didn't waste time with complaints. Instead, she got to work, and thanks to her incredible letters to her daughter, Nabby, we have a vivid, first-hand account of what it was like to set up a home in the middle of a construction zone. These letters are treasures, giving us a personal, human glimpse into this monumental moment in American history. Imagine arriving at this grand, stone mansion, only to find it damp, drafty, and lacking basic necessities. There was no running water, of course. The main staircase wasn't even built yet. To get from the staterooms on the first floor to their private quarters on the second, the president and first lady had to use a simple, unadorned back staircase. The grand entrance we see today was just a dream in the architect's mind. The house was so large and incomplete that it presented some very unusual challenges. Abigail famously wrote about the struggle to find enough firewood to heat the cavernous rooms. She mentioned that a whole cord of wood, a massive stack, would barely last a day. And even then, the drafts would make them shiver. The plaster on the walls was still wet, making the air perpetually damp and chilly. But Abigail was nothing if not resourceful. One of her most famous and enduring quotes perfectly captures her practical, make-do spirit. With no designated laundry yard and a house full of wet plaster, she needed a place to dry the family's clothes. Where did she choose? The largest, driest room available. In a letter to her daughter, she wrote, "We have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience. Without, and the great unfinished audience room I make a drying room of, to hang up the clothes in." Can you picture it? The East Room, the very same space where today we see elegant receptions, bill signings, and state dinners, was once the First Lady's laundry room. She hung lines of wet clothes across this grand, unfinished hall, simply because it was the most practical solution. This single image tells us so much about Abigail Adams and the early days of the White House. It speaks to her resilience, her lack of pretension, and her determination to create a functioning home for her family, no matter the circumstances. She wasn't just the president's wife. She was the manager of a household, facing the same daily chores as any other woman of her time, who's on a much grander and stranger scale. Her letters also paint a picture of the isolation. Washington was a brand new city, with few established social circles. The Adamses were pioneers, not just politically, but socially. Abigail wrote about the wilderness city, a place with grand avenues mapped out but very few houses built upon them. It was a lonely start for the nation's capital. Despite the hardships, Abigail saw the potential. She understood the symbolism of their new home. She was laying the foundation, not just for the physical house, but for the role of the First Lady and the social life of the capital. She hosted the first ever reception in the White House, holding it in the one fully furnished room, the oval drawing room that is now the Blue Room. Even though their time in the White House was brief, about 4 months before John Adams's term, Abigail's influence was profound. Her letters provide the most detailed account we have of the building's earliest days as a residence. They transform it from a cold, stone monument into a living, breathing home, complete with laundry, chilly drafts, and the unwavering spirit of a woman determined to make the best of it. Her words remind us that history isn't just about grand events and political decrees. It's about people. It's about the daily struggles and small triumphs. It's about hanging your washing in an unfinished audience room because that's what needs to be done. Abigail Adams didn't just move into the president's house. She breathed life into it, leaving an indelible mark that continues to shape its story. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that a house is just a structure, but it's the people within it who make it a home. And in the winter of 1800, against all odds, Abigail Adams began the long and noble tradition of making the White House a home for America. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this glimpse into the life of the remarkable Abigail Adams. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories from inside the White House. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're stepping back in time to November 1800, exploring a truly unique chapter in American history. Chapter 10. Life Inside the Unfinished Mansion. We're talking about the very first days of the White House, when President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Adams became its first residence. Now, if you're picturing a grand, fully furnished palace, you might want to adjust that image. The reality was far from the polished perfection we see today. It was a construction site, a shell of a building, and a true test of the Adams family's resilience. Imagine moving into your new home. But it's not just any home, it's the future residence of every U.S. president. The excitement must have been immense, but so were the challenges. When the Adamses arrived, the White House was a cold, damp, and cavernous structure. The paint was still wet on the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of plaster and sawdust. The grand staircase wasn't even built yet. Can you picture the First Lady having to navigate a temporary wooden ladder to get to her living quarters? It's a detail that really grounds this monumental building in a very human, very relatable reality. Out of the 36 rooms in the main building, only about half a dozen were actually plastered and ready for use. This meant the entire presidential household, family and staff included, had to cram into a few finished spaces. Forget private studies and elegant sitting rooms. This was more like communal living in a half-finished castle. The family's private quarters were on the second floor, but even these were far from luxurious. They were drafty and difficult to heat, a major problem as the harsh Washington winter began to set in. One of the biggest challenges was simply keeping warm. The house had numerous fireplaces, 13 of them, to be exact, but getting enough wood to fuel them all was a constant struggle. They needed a massive supply, and the logistics of chopping and hauling that much firewood into a brand new, incomplete city were a daily headache. Abigail Adams wrote in her letters about the cold, describing how they had to keep fires blazing day and night just to take the chill out of the air. It wasn't about comfort. It was about basic survival against the elements in their own home. And what about staff? A residence of this size would normally require a small army of servants, but in these early days, help was incredibly scarce. The new capital city of Washington was barely a city at all. It was more like a collection of scattered buildings in a muddy field. Finding experienced household staff willing to move to this remote, undeveloped area was nearly impossible. The few servants they did have were overworked, trying to manage a massive, incomplete house with limited resources. Abigail Adams, a woman accustomed to a well-run household, found herself having to personally oversee even the most basic chores. This brings us to one of the most famous and telling details about their life. The East Room. Today, the East Room is the largest and most formal public room in the White House, used for grand ceremonies, concerts, and presidential receptions. It's a symbol of American power and elegance, but for Abigail Adams, its purpose was far more practical. Since the room was unfinished, vast, and drafty, it was essentially useless for entertaining. So what did she do? She used it as her laundry room. That's right, the First Lady of the United States was hanging the presidential laundry shirts, linens, and all lawn lines strung across the magnificent, unplastered East Room. She wrote about it in a letter to her daughter, a detail that has become legendary. It's such a powerful image, isn't it? It perfectly captures the contrast between the grand vision for the White House and the rugged, make-do reality of its first occupants. It speaks volumes about Abigail's practical nature and her ability to adapt to any situation with grace and a bit of Yankee ingenuity. She saw a problem, no dedicated space to dry laundry, and found a solution, even if it meant turning a future state ballroom into a temporary laundromat. Let's talk about furniture and furnishings. You'd think the president's house would be filled with the finest pieces, right? Well, not exactly. The Adamses had shipped their own personal furniture from their home in Quincy, Mass. However, the journey was long and difficult. Several crates were lost or delayed at sea, arriving weeks or even months late. So, for a time, they were living with a sparse collection of their own belongings, scattered throughout the enormous, empty rooms. It must have felt like camping indoors. The house was also missing many of its grand fixtures. The famous chandeliers we associate with the White House simply weren't there yet. Illumination came from a more humble source. Candles. Hundreds of them. Imagine the daily task of lighting, trimming, and replacing candles throughout this vast building, with wax dripping onto unfinished floors. The flickering candlelight would have cast long, dancing shadows on the bare walls, creating a spooky, almost gothic atmosphere in the evenings. It was a far cry from the brilliantly lit receptions of later administrations. Despite all these hardships, the cold, the lack of staff, the missing furniture, the constant construction noise, and the sheer inconvenience of it, old Adams' family didn't complain excessively. Instead, they adapted. They embodied a spirit of resilience and pragmatism that was characteristic of the early American Republic. John and Abigail saw their time in the unfinished mansion not just as a personal hardship, but thus a duty. They were establishing the new seat of government, and they understood the symbolic importance of the president residing in the designated executive mansion, no matter its condition. In her letters, Abigail Adams expressed a sense of optimism and vision. While she noted the discomforts, she also described the beauty of the surrounding landscape, the view of the Potomac River, and the potential of the new city. She knew she was living in a place that would one day be the heart of a great nation. C.W. This house is built for ages to come. She could see past the wet plaster and the laundry lines to the future, to the history that would unfold within those walls. This period was a microcosm of the nation itself, a grand project, still under construction, full of challenges, but brimming with potential. The Adamses' life in the unfinished White House shows us that the foundations of our nation were built on luxury and ease, but on hard work, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in a future that was still taking shape. They weren't just occupying a building. They were turning a house into a home and a construction site into the symbolic center of American democracy. Their story reminds us that even the most revered institutions have humble, messy beginnings. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explored this fascinating and often overlooked chapter of American history. It really gives you a new appreciation for the White House and the people who first called it home. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the past. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Picture this. The year is 1800. A new century is dawning, and a new capital city is being born. But if you were to visit Washington, D.C. back then, you wouldn't find the bustling metropolis we know today. Instead, you'd find yourself in the middle of what felt like a vast, untamed wilderness. When the U.S. government officially moved to the District of Columbia in the summer of 1800, it was a far cry from the grand vision laid out by its planners. Abigail Adams, the first lady to live in the White House, famously got lost 4 hours in the woods just trying to travel from Baltimore. That's how dense the wilderness was. The city was a patchwork of forests, swamps, and fields, with a few buildings scattered about like lonely outposts on a frontier. The grand avenues we see today. In 1800, they were little more than muddy tracks carved through the trees. Pennsylvania Avenue, the famous thoroughfare connecting the Capitol and the White House, was described as a deep morass, covered with alder bushes. After a rainstorm, these roads became impassable rivers of mud, trapping wagons and frustrating the few residents and government officials who called this place home. Traveling from one part of the city to another was a genuine adventure, and often a messy one. The population was tiny. Only a few thousand people lived in the entire district, and they were spread out in small, isolated settlements. There was Georgetown, an already established port town, and a few boarding houses and taverns clustered near the government buildings. But for the most part, the landscape was dominated by nature, not people. Imagine looking out from Capitol Hill and seeing mostly trees and swampland, with the Potomac River winding its way through the distance. It was a city in name only, a bold idea still waiting to take root. And at the heart of this wilderness stood two magnificent, yet solitary, structures: the Capitol building and the President's house, what we now call the White House. Even these iconic buildings were incomplete. The Capitol had only one wing finished, the North Wing, where the Senate, the House of Representatives, and even the Supreme Court would all cram together. The White House was large and imposing, but it felt cold and unfinished. Abigail Adams famously hung her laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room because there was nowhere else to do it. These two buildings, standing alone amidst the mud and the trees, were powerful symbols. They were monuments, not to what Washington, D.C. was asterisk, but to what it was meant to be asterisk. They represented the grand idea of a permanent, unified federal government, a beacon of democracy in a world of monarchies. But in 1800, they looked more like follies, lonely and isolated in a vast, empty landscape. It was a city built on a dream, a promise of future greatness. The foreign diplomats who arrived were utterly baffled. They came from the grand capitals of Europe, London, Paris, Vienna, with their ancient stone buildings, paved streets, and bustling cultural scenes, and they found this a city of magnificent distances, as one diplomat sarcastically called it, mocking the vast, empty spaces between the few points of interest. They wrote letters home, describing the rustic, almost primitive conditions, wondering if this fledgling American experiment could possibly succeed. To them, Washington was a joke, a capital of miserable huts in a wilderness city. Life for the handful of government officials was challenging. Congressmen lived in crowded boarding houses, often several to a room, sharing meals and debating politics around the dinner table. There were few amenities. No theaters, no great libraries, no real social scene to speak of. Their world revolved around the business of government because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do. It was a stark, focused existence, forged in the mud and isolation of a brand new capital. Yet, there was an undeniable sense of purpose and optimism. Those who were there, from President John Adams to the clerks and construction workers, were pioneers. They weren't just building a city, they were building a nation. They were laying the physical and political foundations for the future. Every brick laid, every law passed in that single wing of the capital was an act of faith. It was a belief that this muddy, sparsely populated plot of land would one day grow into a worthy capital for a great republic. They had to be visionaries. They had to look past the swamps and see the monuments. They had to walk down muddy paths and imagine grand avenues filled with people. They had to sit in an unfinished capital and hear the echoes of future debates that would shape the course of a nation. The Washington, D.C. of 1800 wasn't a city of stone and marble. It was a city of ideas, a raw, untamed landscape where the American dream was just beginning to be built. It's a powerful reminder that all great things have humble beginnings. The next time you see a picture of the gleaming U.S. Capitol or the iconic White House, remember what surrounded them at the turn of the 19th century. Remember the mud, the forests, the swamps, and the handful of pioneers who believed in the idea of Washington when it was little more than a lonely outpost in the wilderness. They built the foundation for the city we know today, turning a bold, almost audacious idea into a living, breathing reality. Thanks for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories from history, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what other historical moments you'd like to explore. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American presidents. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 12, John Adams' Presidential Challenges. If you thought winning the revolution was the hard part, just wait. Adams inherited a nation teetering on the brink, and his presidency was anything but a smooth ride. So, picture this. John Adams steps into the presidency in 1797, right after George Washington. He's got massive shoes to fill, and the world is watching. But instead of a honeymoon period, he's immediately thrown into a geopolitical firestorm. The French Revolution has spiraled into chaos, and France, our former ally, is now acting like a playground bully on the high seas. They're seizing American ships, disrupting our trade, and generally causing a huge diplomatic headache. This whole situation became known as the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict that had Americans furious and demanding action. Adams, ever the diplomat, wanted to avoid a full-blown war. He sends a delegation to Paris to negotiate, but what happens next is just unbelievable. The French foreign minister, Talleyrand, sends 3 secret agents dubbed X, Y, and Z by the Americans to demand a massive bribe just to start talking. Can you imagine? Pay us $250,000 and maybe we'll listen. The American envoys were rightfully outraged. Their response became a rallying cry back home. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This XYZ affair lit a fire under the American public. Suddenly, war with France seemed inevitable. The pressure on Adams was immense. The Federalist Party, his own party, was split. One faction, led by the influential Alexander Hamilton, was beating the war drums, seeing this as an opportunity to build a powerful standing army and crush their political opponents, the Democratic Republicans, who were generally more sympathetic to France. Adams, however, was caught in the middle. He knew a war could destroy the young nation, but he also had to look strong. It was a classic political tightrope walk. He authorized the creation of the Department of the Navy and strengthened our coastal defenses, preparing for the worst while still hoping for the best. Now, let's talk about the domestic front, because things were getting just as messy at home. The intense anti-French sentiment and the fear of foreign spies led to one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These were actually 4 separate laws, passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress and signed by Adams. The Alien Acts made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous. This was clearly aimed at French and Irish immigrants who tended to support the Democratic Republic. But the real bombshell was the Sedition Act. This law made it a crime to write, print, or say anything false, scandalous, and malicious about the government, the Congress, or the president. In essence, it criminalized political criticism. Think about that for a second. In a country founded on the principles of free speech and open debate, the government was now jailing its critics. Newspaper editors, writers, and even a sitting congressman were prosecuted under this act, mostly for speaking out against Adams and the Federalists. It was a direct assault on the First Amendment, and it created a massive political firestorm. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, leading the opposition, were horrified. They saw the Sedition Act as a blatant power grab, a step towards tyranny. In secret, they drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These documents argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and that states had the right and the duty to declare such federal laws null and void. This concept, known as nullification, planted a dangerous seed that would grow into the states' rights arguments leading up to the Civil War. The country wasn't just divided, it was fractured along deep ideological lines. The dream of a united nation seemed to be slipping away. John Adams found himself increasingly isolated. He was criticized by the Democratic Republicans for being a monarchist who trampled on liberty. At the same time, the hardline High Federalists in his own party, led by Hamilton, were furious with him for not declaring war on France. They saw his pursuit of peace as a betrayal. Adams was a man without a party, a president without a unified base of support. He was trying to steer the ship of state through a hurricane, with half his crew wanting to go one way and the other half trying to sabotage the engine. Despite the immense pressure, Adams held firm to his principles. He believed that a war with France would be a disaster for the United States, and he was determined to prevent it, even if it cost him his political career. Against the wishes of his own cabinet and party leaders, Adams made a bold and lonely decision. In 1799, he sent another peace mission to France. By this time, Napoleon Bonaparte had come to power, and he was more interested in consolidating his rule in Europe than in fighting a pointless war with America. The new mission was successful, and the Treaty of Mortefontaine was signed in 1800, officially ending the quasi-war. This was, without a doubt, Adams' finest moment as president. Ayod single-handedly averted a potentially catastrophic war and preserved the fragile independence of the nation. But the political cost was enormous. By making peace, he had alienated the powerful Hamiltonian wing of the Federalist Party, ensuring his defeat in the upcoming election of 1800. He chose country over party, peace over popularity. It was a decision that solidified his legacy as a statesman but doomed his presidency. The election of 1800 was one of the nastiest in American history, filled with personal attacks and political muds. Adams was portrayed as a tyrant, while his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, was painted as a radical atheist. The country was deeply polarized. In the end, Adams lost to his old friend and now bitter rival, Jefferson. It was a peaceful transfer of power, a remarkable achievement in itself. But for Adams, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He left the presidency a lonely and misunderstood figure, his accomplishments overshadowed by the controversy of his term. Looking back, John Adams' presidency is a powerful lesson in leadership. He faced down foreign threats, navigated treacherous domestic politics, and made unpopular decisions for the good of the nation. The Alien and Sedition Acts remain a dark stain on his record, a cautionary tale about the dangers of sacrificing liberty for security. Yet, his courageous pursuit of peace with France stands as a testament to his character and his ultimate devotion to the Republic. He was a complex, principled, and often prickly man who struggled to unite a divided country, a challenge that remains as relevant today as it was over 200 years ago. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the Adams presidency. It's a fascinating and crucial chapter in our nation's story. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal, bizarre, and downright dirty political battles in the nation's early years. The election of 1800. If you think modern politics is rough, you haven't seen anything yet. This wasn't just an election. It was a battle for the very soul of America, pitting two former friends, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, against each other in a contest that nearly tore the young country apart. So, let's set the stage. On one side, we have John Adams, the incumbent president. He's a Federalist, a party that believed in a strong, centralized federal government, a robust national bank, and friendly relations with Great Britain. Adams was brilliant, a key figure in the Revolution, but also seen by his opponents as stubborn, aristocratic, and maybe a little too fond of kingly power. His presidency had been rocky, marked by the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which critics claimed were a direct assault on free speech. The Federalists were genuinely worried that the radical, revolutionary ideas from France would infect America and lead to chaos and anarchy. On the other side, we have Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, leading the Democratic-Republican Party. Yes, you heard that right. The president and vice president were from opposing parties, a quirky feature of the original Constitution. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian republic, a nation of independent yeoman farmers with a limited federal government. He was a champion of states' rights and a staunch supporter of the French Revolution, at least initially. His followers saw Adams and the Federalists as monarchists in disguise, plotting to turn the United States into a copy of the British Empire, complete with a hereditary elite and a repressed lower class. These two men hadn't always been enemies. Far from Italiano. They were comrades in arms during the Revolution, working side by side to draft the Declaration of Independence. They were diplomats together in Europe, sharing a deep bond of friendship and mutual respect. But by 1800, that friendship was in tatters, shredded by a decade of intense political division. The country had split into two camps, and Adams and Jefferson had become their respective figures. The stakes felt incredibly high. Both sides believed that if the other won, it would spell the end of the American experiment. Now, let's talk about the campaign itself, because this is where things get truly wild. There were no televised debates or slick campaign ads back then. Instead, the battle was fought in newspapers, pamphlets, and backroom whispers. And let me tell you, the mudslinging was epic. The Federalists went after Jefferson with everything they had. They painted him as a dangerous radical, an atheist who would destroy religion in America. One Federalist newspaper warned that if Jefferson were elected, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. They claimed he would confiscate Bibles and turn churches into temples of reason, just like the French revolutionaries. They attacked his personal life, spreading rumors about his relationship with his enslaved servant, Sally Hemings. They called him a coward for fleeing his post as governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War. To them, Jefferson was a godless, French-loving anarchist who would plunge the country into bloody chaos. But the Democratic Republicans gave as good as they got. They relentlessly attacked John Adams, portraying him as a tyrant with a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Ouch. They accused him of wanting to be a king, pointing to his support for the Alien and Sedition Acts as proof that he had no respect for the Constitution or individual liberties. They mocked his physique, calling him his rotundity. They claimed he was secretly planning to create an American dynasty by having a son, John Quincy Adams, marry one of King George III's daughters. They were convinced Adams was a power-hungry monarchist who would crush the spirit of 1776 under the heel of a powerful central government. The campaign was a hurricane of accusations, slander, and propaganda. It was personal, vicious, and it consumed the nation. Families were divided, friendships were broken, and the political atmosphere was toxic. It seemed like the Republic itself was hanging by a thread, threatened by the very passions it had unleashed. So, when the votes were finally cast, what happened? Well, it got even more complicated. Under the original system, each elector in the Electoral College cast 2 votes for president. The person with the most votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. Jefferson's party had a plan. All their electors would cast one vote for Thomas Jefferson and one for his chosen running mate, Aaron Burr, with one elector abstaining from Burr to ensure Jefferson came in first. But the plan went wrong. Someone forgot to tell that one elector to throw away his vote. The result? A perfect tie. Both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr received 73 electoral votes. John Adams, the incumbent president, came in third with 65 and was officially out of the race. According to the Constitution, a tie in the Electoral College meant the decision went to the House of Representatives. But this wasn't the new House that had just been elected. It was the old, lame duck House, which was still controlled by the defeated Federalist Party. And they hated Thomas Jefferson. What followed was a constitutional crisis. The House was deadlocked. For days, they voted again and again. 35 ballots were cast, and each time, the result was a tie. Jefferson couldn't get the majority of states he needed to win. Some Federalists, in a desperate attempt to block their archenemy Jefferson, decided to vote for Aaron Burr. They figured Burr, a New York politician known for his ambition and lack of firm principles, would be more willing to cut a deal with them than the ideologically rigid Jefferson. The country held its breath. There were rumors of civil war. Militias in Virginia and Pennsylvania began preparing to march on the new capital. Washington don't say to install Jefferson by force if the Federalists tried to steal the election. The future of the Republic was on a knife's edge. This is where a surprising figure enters the story to play the role of kingmaker Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton and Jefferson were bitter political rivals. They despised each other. Hamilton once said of Jefferson, "I have always opposed his views with energy, though in some respects with success." However, Hamilton disliked Aaron Burr even more. He considered Burr to be a man utterly without principle, a dangerous and untrustworthy opportunist who would stop at nothing to gain power. Faced with a choice between the two, Hamilton chose what he considered the lesser of two evils. He wrote furiously to his fellow Federalists, urging them to back Jefferson. He argued that Jefferson, for all his flaws, at least had some political beliefs, and was not as personally corrupt as Burr. In one letter, he wrote that Jefferson was by far not so dangerous a man as Burr. Finally, after 7 days and 36 ballots, Hamilton's influence, combined with Jefferson's private assurances to some Federalists that he would not dismantle the entire Federalist financial system, broke the deadlock. A few Federalist representatives abstained from voting, giving Jefferson the majority of states he needed. On February 17, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was officially elected the third president of the United States. The election of 1800 was more than just a change of leadership. It was what Jefferson himself called the Revolution of 1800. For the first time in modern history, power was peacefully transferred from one political party to its bitter rival. There was no coup, no civil war, no violent upheaval. The Federalist Party, after controlling the government for its first 12 years, accepted defeat and stepped aside. This peaceful transition of power was a monumental achievement. It proved that the American constitutional system could work, even under extreme pressure. It established a precedent that has been the bedrock of American democracy ever since. In his inaugural address, Jefferson sought to heal the nation's deep wounds. He famously declared, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He called for unity and an end to the bitter partisanship that had nearly destroyed the country. While the political fighting certainly didn't end, the crisis had passed. John Adams, in a quiet act of dignity, left Washington, D.C. in the early morning hours before the inauguration, becoming the first president to be defeated for re-election and to peacefully hand power to his opponent. Though their friendship wouldn't be rekindled for another decade, the system they both helped create had survived its first great test. So, the next time you think a political campaign is getting out of hand, remember the election of 1800. It was a story of friendship and betrayal, of vicious slandering amended ideals, and a constitutional crisis that ended not in violence, but in a peaceful affirmation of the democratic process. It was a defining moment that proved the young American Republic could endure. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories about the moments that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what you think was the most shocking part of this election. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the life of John Adams. We've reached a pivotal and poignant moment, his final days in the White House. This is Chapter 14, a story of quiet dignity in the face of political defeat. As the year 1801 dawned, a strange quiet settled over the new president's house in Washington. The flurry of political activity that had defined John Adams's presidency was winding down. The election of 1800 had been a bitter and bruising affair, and Adams had lost to his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, all that was left was to pack up, say his goodbyes, and leave the nascent capital city. In these final weeks, Adams wasn't a man defeated, but rather a statesman in deep reflection. He didn't rage against the political tides that had turned against him. Instead, he found solace in his work, diligently signing papers and appointing federal judges, including the monumental appointment of John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This was his final act of shaping the nation's future, a legacy that would long outlast his single term in office. He would walk through the half-finished rooms of the executive mansion, a building that was more a construction site than a home. The plaster was still damp, the grand staircases were temporary, and the vast, empty rooms echoed with the sounds of a new city being born. For Adams, this unfinished house was a powerful symbol. It represented the American experiment itself. A grand project, still under construction, with its future far from certain, yet full of immense promise. Imagine him standing by a window, looking out over the muddy landscape of what would one day become the bustling capital. He had poured his life into the foundation of this republic, from the fiery debates of the Continental Congress to the lonely and challenging years of his presidency. He had steered the young nation through treacherous waters, avoiding a full-scale war with France and establishing the foundations of American law and governance. His letters to his beloved Abigail during this time are filled not with bitterness, but with a profound sense of perspective. He wrote about his faith in the people and in the constitutional system they had created. He believed, truly believed, that the peaceful transfer of power, even to a political rival, was the ultimate test and triumph of their republican ideals. "I pray to heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house," he wrote, "and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." These weren't the words of a sore loser. They were the words of a patriot. More than he loved power, he understood that the presidency was a temporary trust, a service to the nation, not a personal possession. His quiet and orderly departure set a crucial precedent, demonstrating that in this new form of government, power was transferred not by force, but by the will of the people. The atmosphere in Washington was tense. The election had been so close and contentious that it was ultimately decided in the House of Representatives. Rumors flew, and some feared that the transition would be violent or chaotic. But Adams remained a pillar of stability. He was focused on ensuring a smooth and lawful handover to his successor. On the cold, dark morning of March 4th, 8 hours before Jefferson's inauguration, John Adams boarded a public stagecoach and began his long journey home to Massachusetts. He didn't stay for the ceremony. Some have painted this as a petty act, a snub to his rival. But those who knew Adams understood it differently. It was the act of a man who believed the focus should be on the office, not the individual. The transition was complete. His duty was done. It was time for the new president to take the stage, and for the old one to quietly exit. His departure was as unceremonious as his arrival in Washington had been. No grand farewells, no military parades, just a solitary figure, a founding father, heading home. It was a humble end to a presidency that had been anything but. He had faced down international crises, navigated treacherous domestic politics, and made decisions that shaped the course of American history. As his coach rumbled northward, Adams could reflect on a life of extraordinary service. He had been a lawyer, a diplomat, a revolutionary, a vice president, and a president. He had sacrificed years away from his family and his farm for the cause of American independence and the establishment of its government. He had made mistakes, certainly, and had his share of political enemies. but no one could ever question his unwavering dedication to the Republic. His quiet departure from the unfinished White House wasn't an admission of failure. It was the ultimate expression of his faith in the democratic process he had helped create. It was a testament to the idea that the nation was more important than any single leader. The mansion would be completed, the city would grow, and the Republic, he hoped, would endure. John Adams had laid his brick in the foundation, and now, with dignity and a quiet sense of accomplishment, he was going home, leaving the unfinished work to future generations. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. It's a powerful reminder that true leadership is often found not in the seeking of power, but in the grace with which it is relinquished. If you found this story as moving as I do, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we delve into a moment of profound, quiet significance in American history. Chapter 15, Adams' Farewell. This isn't a story of grand battles or fiery speeches, but of a quiet departure that spoke volumes, marking the end of an entire revolutionary epoch. Imagine the scene. It's the early hours of March 4th, 1801. The new capital city, Washington, is still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. The air is cold, crisp, and filled with a sense of anticipation for the day to come. This is Inauguration Day for Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. But our focus isn't on the incoming president. Instead, we turn our attention to the still under construction president's house, what we now call the White House. Inside, a single figure is preparing to leave. Not just the building, but the very center of the nation's political life. That man is John Adams, the second president of the United States, and his departure is as unconventional as his entire career. There is no fanfare, no grand procession, no tearful goodbyes from a throng of supporters. There are no cheering crowds lining the streets, no final address to the nation he helped to build. Instead, in the deep quiet of the morning, long before the sun would rise to illuminate Jefferson's inauguration, John Adams boards a public stage. His exit is unceremonious, almost stealthy. It's a stark contrast to the pomp and circumstance we associate with presidential transitions today. He is simply a man, a citizen, heading home. This quiet act is the final punctuation mark on a life dedicated to the American Revolution and the establishment of its government. With this silent departure, the era of the Revolutionary Titans, the generation that had risked everything for independence, was effectively coming to a close. To truly understand the weight of this moment, we have to rewind a bit. The election of 1800 had been one of the most bitter and divisive in American history. It pitted two former friends and revolutionary compatriots against each other. Adams, the incumbent Federalist, and Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic Republic. The campaign was brutal, filled with personal attacks and partisan vitriol that makes modern politics look tame. Adams was painted as a monarchist, a tyrant in the making, while Jefferson was accused of being a radical atheist who would plunge the nation into French-style revolutionary chaos. The result was a victory for Jefferson and a painful, public rejection for Adams. For Adams, this defeat was more than just a political loss. It was a personal wound. He had sacrificed so much for his country. He had spent years abroad as a diplomat, separated from his beloved wife Abigail and his children. He had faced down immense pressure, navigating the nation through the treacherous waters of international conflict, particularly the quasi-war with France. He had made the unpopular but principled decision to seek peace rather than declare a full-scale war, a choice that likely cost him his re-election, but saved the young nation from a potentially disastrous conflict. In his mind, he had served with integrity and honor, yet the American people, his people, had chosen another. The sting of that rejection was sharp and deep. Adding to his personal grief, just a few months before his term ended, his son Charles, who had struggled for years with alcoholism, passed away. Adams was a man steeped in sorrow, both public and private. He felt misunderstood, unappreciated, and betrayed, not just by his political opponents, but by some within his own party, like Alexander Hamilton, who had worked to undermine his presidency. So, as he sat in the cold, sparse rooms of the new president's house during his final winter in office, he was a lonely figure. The capital city itself was a raw, unfinished landscape. A metaphor, perhaps, for the unfinished business and unresolved tensions of the nation. His decision to leave before Jefferson's inauguration has been debated by historians for centuries. Was it an act of petulance, a final, bitter snub to his successor? Some of his critics certainly saw it that way. They painted it as the sour grapes of a sore loser, unable to face the man who had defeated him, and perhaps there was an element of that. Adams was a proud, passionate, and often stubborn man. The thought of witnessing the triumph of a political philosophy he deeply distrusted, led by a man he felt had wronged him, would have been galling. To stand by and applaud as Jefferson took the oath of office might have felt like a betrayal of his own principles and a validation of the attacks made against him. However, there's a deeper, more charitable, and I believe more accurate, way to view his departure. It was also an act of profound patriotism. In 1801, the concept of a peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties was entirely new. It had never happened before in modern history. Republics of the past had crumbled into civil war or dictatorship when power changed hands. The air was thick with tension. There were rumors of Federalist militias refusing to accept the result. The transition was a moment of extreme national vulnerability. By leaving quietly, by removing himself from the scene, Adams ensured that the day belonged entirely to the new administration and to the Constitution. He was making a powerful statement. The office is greater than the man. The continuity of the Republic is more important than personal feelings or partisan pride. His silent exit was, in its own way, his final service to the nation, ensuring that the transfer of power was peaceful and orderly. He was demonstrating that the system he helped create actually worked, as his coach rumbled northward on the muddy roads, away from the nascent capital and toward his beloved home, peace-filled, in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was leaving behind a world he had helped to shape. Think of it. Adams had been there from the very beginning. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, a fierce advocate for independence, a member of the committee that drafted the Declaration. He had secured crucial loans from the Dutch during the war, and he was a key negotiator of the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the conflict and recognized American independence. He served as the first vice president and then as president. His entire adult life had been intertwined with the fate of the United States. He was one of the last of that founding band to hold the nation's highest office. Washington was gone. Franklin was gone. Now, Adams was receding from the stage. His journey home was not a retreat into obscurity, but a return to himself. He was going back to being Farmer John, back to his books, his letters, and his farm. He was returning to Abigail, his partner, his intellectual equal, his greatest comfort and staunchest supporter. The next 25 years of his life would be spent in Quincy, in a retirement that was anything but idle. It was from there that he would watch the nation continue to grow and change. It was from there that he would eventually, miraculously, reconcile with Thomas Jefferson. Their late-life correspondence is one of the great treasures of American letters, a moving dialogue between two old revolutionaries looking back on the world they had made. But on that cold March morning in 1801, all of that was in the future. On that morning, it was just about the end of a presidency, the end of a political career, and, most significantly, the end of an era. When John Adams left Washington in the dark, he wasn't just a defeated president heading home. He was a symbol of the entire revolutionary generation, passing the torch to a new one. His quiet, unceremonious departure was a humble, final act of service, ensuring that the nation's focus was not on the past, but on the future, and on the peaceful continuation of the great American experiment he had given his life to build. It was a farewell, not just from a man, but from a foundational age of American history. Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration of a truly pivotal moment. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please consider hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts on Adams' departure in the comments below. Was it bitterness, or was it patriotism? I look forward to reading your perspectives. Until next time, take care. Welcome back to our journey through the annals of American history. Today, we're diving into a story that's literally carved into the stone and spirit of the most famous house in the United States. We're talking about the White House, and a special blessing that has echoed through its halls for over 2 centuries. Let's set the scene. The year is 1800. The new capital city, Washington, D.C., is still a muddy, sprawling construction site. The president's house, as it was then known, is far from the grand mansion we see today. It's drafty, unfinished, and barely habitable. On November 1st, 1800, its very first resident moves in, the second president of the United States, John Adams. He arrived late in the evening, weary from his journey. The house was cold, and only a few rooms were plastered. Firewood was scarce, and the main staircase wasn't even built yet. Adams, ever the practical and sometimes grumpy New Englander, had to use a temporary wooden staircase in the back. It was hardly a glamorous beginning for the new executive residence. His wife, Abigail, wouldn't join him for another 2 weeks. And when she did, she famously had to hang the presidential laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room. But it was on his second night in this cold, imposing new house, on November 2nd, 1800, that John Adams penned a letter to his beloved Abigail. In T's letter, he shared his thoughts, his worries, and his hopes for this new home, not just for himself, but for all the leaders who would follow him. And within that letter, he wrote a simple, yet profound, sentence, a sentence that would become one of the most famous prayers in American history. He wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Let's break that down. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house. This is more than just a wish for good luck. It's a plea for divine favor, for protection and grace to be upon the physical structure itself. Adams understood that this building was more than just a home. It was a symbol of the young, fragile republic. He was asking for a blessing on the very idea of the American presidency. Then comes the second part, ... and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. This is where Adams's vision truly shines. He wasn't just thinking about his own short term. He was looking down the long corridor of time, thinking about the future presidents, people he would never meet, from generations he could only imagine. He was praying for them, for their well-being, for their families who would live with the immense pressures of the office. And finally, the powerful conclusion. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. This wasn't just a prayer, it was a charge. Standard. Adams was setting the bar for all future leaders. He was imploring that the highest virtues, honesty, and wisdom be the guiding principles for anyone who held the nation's top office. He knew that the success or failure of the American experiment rested on the character of its leaders. This beautiful sentiment could have easily been lost to history. Just another line in a private letter, but its power resonated. For over a century, the prayer was known to historians and scholars, a poignant footnote to the Adams presidency. But it was in the 20th century that its legacy was truly cemented. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president. As the nation grappled with the Great Depression and the looming threat of World War II, FDR found deep meaning in Adams's words. He saw them as a connection to the founding principles of the nation, a source of strength and inspiration during a time of immense crisis. In 1945, as the White House was undergoing a major renovation, FDR made a momentous decision. He ordered that Adams's prayer be carved into the marble mantelpiece of the state dining room. This was the grand room where the president would host world leaders, dignitaries, and influential guests. From that moment on, every formal dinner, every state reception would take place under the watchful gaze of this powerful inscription. Think about the significance of that placement. Imagine being a foreign leader, dining at the White House, and seeing those words carved in stone. It's a bold statement about America's aspirations for its leadership. It's a constant reminder, not just to the president, but to the entire world, of the ideals the nation strives for. The inscription reads, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." When President Harry Truman oversaw a complete gutting and reconstruction of the White House interior from 1949 to 1952, he made sure the mantle and its precious inscription were carefully preserved and reinstalled. It had become an inseparable part of the building's identity. This prayer has been a silent witness to history. It was there as John F. Kennedy navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis. It watched as Lyndon B. Johnson signed landmark civil rights legislation. It was present as Ronald Reagan challenged the Soviet Union to tear down this wall. It has been a constant through moments of triumph and tragedy, of war and peace, of division and unity. Every president since FDR has lived and worked with this reminder of their duty. It's a nonpartisan, timeless standard. It doesn't belong to one political party or ideology. It belongs to the office of the presidency itself, and to the American people. It connects the present day directly back to the very first occupant of the White House, linking every administration in a continuous chain of hope and responsibility. The story of the White House prayer is a beautiful example of how a simple, heartfelt expression can transcend its time to become an enduring national treasure. It is a testament to John Adams' foresight and his deep love for the country he helped to build. He wasn't just moving into a new house. He was consecrating a space for the future of American democracy. So, the next time you see a picture of the state dining room, look closely at the fireplace. That inscription is more than just a decoration. It is the foundational wish for the nation, a prayer for leadership rooted in integrity and wisdom, left behind by a founder who understood the immense weight of the office and the enduring hope for the republic. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical deep dive. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters from our shared past. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into the final chapter of our story, focusing on the enduring legacy of a remarkable woman, Abigail Adams. Long after her time as First Lady, her influence continues to resonate, shaping not just the role of the presidential spouse, but also the very fabric of American society. So, how did this farmer's daughter from Weymouth, Massachusetts, leave such an indelible mark on a nation? Let's explore. Abigail Adams was never one to stand silently in the shadows. Her strength and sharp intellect were the bedrock upon which the Adams family, and in many ways, the early presidency, was built. While John Adams was shaping policy and navigating the turbulent political waters of the new republic, Abigail was managing their farm, raising their children, and handling their finances, all while serving as her husband's most trusted advisor. Her role was far from ceremonial. She was the anchor, the operational manager, and the emotional core of the first family. One of the most precious gifts Abigail left us is her vast collection of letters. With over 2,000 surviving correspondences, she provides an unparalleled, intimate look into the daily realities of the Revolutionary era and the early presidency. These weren't just simple updates. They were detailed accounts filled with political commentary, personal reflections, and sharp observations. Through her eyes, we see the struggles, the triumphs, and the human side of building a nation. She wrote about the high cost of goods during the war, the anxieties of separation, and the challenges of setting up the new presidential residence in Washington, D.C., a city she described as a wilderness. Her letters transform historical figures from distant icons into real people, grappling with everyday problems and monumental tasks. They are a historian's treasure, offering a behind-the-scenes narrative that official documents could never capture. But Abigail's legacy extends far beyond her role as a chronicler and advisor. She was, without a doubt, one of America's earliest and most powerful voices for women's rights. In a time when women were largely excluded from political and intellectual life, Abigail championed the cause of female education and equality. She believed that a strong republic required educated women who could raise virtuous, informed citizens. Her famous plea to her husband in March 1776, to remember the ladies when drafting the new nation's laws, was not a fleeting comment. It was a bold declaration, a call for legal and social recognition that was centuries ahead of its time. She argued that absolute power, whether held by a king or a husband, was dangerous. She wrote, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." This wasn't just about political theory. It was about the fundamental rights and dignity of women. She envisioned a society where women were not merely domestic ornaments, but active, intelligent partners in the great American experiment. She advocated for girls to receive the same quality of education as boys, arguing that it was essential for both their personal development and the health of the nation. Her persistence laid the groundwork for future generations of activists who would continue the long and arduous fight for women as suffrage and equal rights. This forward-thinking vision, this combination of practical wisdom and revolutionary ideals, is perhaps Abigail's most profound contribution. Her influence wasn't just felt by her contemporaries. It echoed down through the generations, shaping the very role of the First Lady. She established a precedent that the president's spouse could be more than just a hostess. She could be a confidant, a policy advisor, and a social advocate. Future First Ladies, from Dolly Madison, who famously saved national treasures during the War of 1812, to Eleanor Roosevelt, who became a global champion for human rights, had walked in the path Abigail first blazed. Eleanor Roosevelt herself often spoke of the inspiration she drew from Abigail's example. She saw in Abigail a model of how a First Lady could use her unique position to advocate for change and give voice to the voiceless. Abigail demonstrated that the role was not defined by rigid expectations, but by the character and convictions of the woman who held it. She proved that one could be a devoted wife and mother while also being a fierce intellectual and a powerful force for progress. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that influence is not always tied to an official title or a public office. Sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with a pen, a clear voice, and an unwavering belief in a more just and equitable world. Think about it. At the very dawn of the United States, when the roles of men and women were strictly defined, Abigail Adams was already challenging the status quo. She wasn't just a witness to history. She was an active participant, a shaper of ideas, and a moral compass for a new nation. Her letters show us the private struggles behind the public victories, reminding us that history is made by real people with real concerns. Her advocacy for women's education wasn't just a personal wish. It was a strategic vision for a stronger, more enlightened republic. She understood that a nation could only rise as high as it was willing to lift all of its citizens. So, when we look back at the founding of America, it's crucial to see beyond the battlefield and the congressional hall. We must look to the homes, the farms, and the letters where so much of the nation's character was forged. There, we find Abigail Adams a farmer, a mother, a First Lady, and a revolutionary thinker. Her legacy is not just in the history books. It's in the very ideal of a partnership-based presidency, in the ongoing struggle for gender equality, and in the powerful example she set for every leader who followed. She taught us that wisdom, courage, and a commitment to justice are the true foundations of a lasting legacy. Her life serves as a powerful reminder that one person, armed with conviction and a powerful voice, can indeed change the world. She didn't just remember the ladies. She ensured they would never be forgotten. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the life of Abigail Adams. Her story is a vital piece of the American puzzle, and one that deserves to be told and retold. If you enjoyed this series and want to see more content like this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We truly appreciate your support. Until next time, take care. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey through the heart of America. Today, we're stepping into Chapter 18, the White House after Adams. Imagine the scene. It's March 4th, 1801. The dusk is barely settled from John and Abigail Adams' departure, and the halls of the not-yet-finished president's house are echoing with a new kind of silence. John Adams, the very first resident, has left the building. His term was a whirlwind of frantic, 4-year rush to establish a new government in a new capital city. He and Abigail were pioneers, turning a construction site into a home and a symbol for a fledgling nation. They were the ones who weathered the cold drafts, the smell of wet plaster, and the loneliness of an unfinished mansion. They laid the first stone, not of the building itself, but of its identity as the home of the American president. Their presence, their struggles, their triumphs day were the first imprint on the soul of the White House. Now, a new chapter begins. Thomas Jefferson, Adams' political rival and successor, is moving in. This transition is monumental. It's the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in American history, a true test of the young republic's ideals. Jefferson, a man of vastly different tastes and political philosophies than Adams, arrives to find a house that is still very much a work in progress. But it's a house that already holds the memories of its first inhabitants. Think about it. Jefferson, a widower, walks through rooms where Abigail Adams had managed a household, entertained dignitaries, and famously hung her laundry to dry in the unfinished East Room. He would have seen the spaces where Adams paced, worried, and penned letters that would shape the future of the country. Jefferson wasn't just moving into a house. He was inheriting a legacy, and like any new homeowner, he immediately started to make it his own. Jefferson, the architect, the inventor, the connoisseur of French culture, had big plans. He saw the president's house not just as a residence, but as a canvas for his own vision of American nation of elegance, intellect, and agrarian virtue. He brought in his French chef, introduced new foods like macaroni and cheese to the presidential table, and transformed the formal levees of his predecessors into more informal, round-table dinners. He added his own architectural touches, designing the low-lying terraces on the east and west wings, which housed service areas like a wine cellar, a pantry, and an ice house. He filled the entrance hall with artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition maps, animal skins, and Native American artifacts, turning the home into a sort of public museum that showcased the nation's westward expansion and scientific curiosity. Each president who followed would continue this tradition. James Madison and his charismatic wife, Dolly, would bring a new level of social grace. Andrew Jackson would throw open the doors for his famously raucous inauguration party. Lincoln would walk its halls at night, burdened by the weight of a nation tearing itself apart. Each family brought their own furniture, their own traditions, their own joys, and their own sorrows. They painted walls, changed curtains, and added new wings. The White House was constantly evolving, a living building that reflected the changing tastes and priorities of its occupants and the nation itself. But through all these changes, the foundational imprint of John Adams remained. He was the first. His was the original experience, the benchmark against which all others would, in some way, be measured. The simple fact that he lived there, that he made it work, consecrated the building. Of course, the story of the White House is not just one of peaceful transitions and decorative changes. It is also a story of incredible resilience, a story of trial by fire. In 1814, during the War of 1812, British forces marched on Washington, D.C. and set the president's house ablaze. The flames gutted the interior, leaving only a blackened, hollowed-out stone shell. It was a devastating blow, a moment when it seemed the young nation's capital, and perhaps the nation itself, might not recover. From the ashes, it could have been abandoned. A new capital could have been built elsewhere. But the decision was made to rebuild on the same spot, using the original walls that had survived the fire. This act of rebuilding was profoundly symbolic. It was a statement of defiance and determination. The White House wasn't just a building. It was an idea. The scorched sandstone walls were painted a brilliant white to cover the smoke stains, giving the mansion its enduring and iconic nickname, the White House. When President James Monroe moved back into the reconstructed building in 1817, it was a powerful symbol of national rebirth. The house had been through a war. It had been destroyed, and yet it was back, stronger and more symbolic than ever. It was a physical testament to the nation's ability to endure, to rebuild, and to carry on. Over the next 2 centuries, the White House would witness countless more challenges. It would undergo massive renovations, like the one under Harry Truman, which saw the entire interior gutted and rebuilt with a modern steel frame. It would be the command center for world wars, the backdrop for civil rights movements, and the scene of both national celebration and profound grief. Through fires, wars, renovations, and the endless parade of presidents, each adding their own layer to its history, the fundamental spirit of the place endures. It's a spirit that began with John and Abigail Adams, huddled against the cold in their grand, unfinished home. It's the spirit of a place that is both a home and a stage, a private residence and the people's house. It's the spirit of continuity, resilience, and the enduring American experiment. The walls may change, the furniture may come and go, but the presence of all who have walked its halls, starting with its very first resident remains, woven into the very fabric of the White House, thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of the White House after Adams. It's a story that continues to unfold with every passing day. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We love hearing from you, so please drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we arrive at a truly iconic chapter. The White House is a symbol of democracy. This isn't just about a building, it's about the very heart of American leadership, a place where the nation's story has been written, rewritten, and lived for over 2 centuries. Think about it. The White House is more than just an address on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's a stage, a command center, and a home, all rolled into one. It's where decisions that shape the world are made, where triumphs are celebrated, and where national grief is shared. From the outside, its stately columns and pristine facade project an image of strength and stability. But inside, it's a living, breathing space, constantly evolving with each new occupant. When John Adams first moved into the unfinished mansion in November of 1800, he probably couldn't have imagined the legacy he was starting. The walls were still damp, and the rooms were vast and cold. In a letter to his wife, Abigail, he wrote a prayer that has since become a cornerstone of the White House's identity. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. That prayer echoes through the halls to this day. It set a precedent, a hope that this house would not just shelter presidents, but would also nurture the very ideals of the Republic. Every leader who has lived here, from Thomas Jefferson with his passion for architecture and innovation, to Abraham Lincoln wrestling with the fate of a divided nation, has added their own chapter to its story. The White House isn't a static museum. It's a dynamic symbol. Its design, inspired by classical principles, was meant to evoke the democratic ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. It was intended to be the people's house, accessible and representative of the nation it served. And over the years, it has certainly lived up to that name. It has been burned by a foreign power, rebuilt with resilience, and expanded to meet the growing demands of a modern presidency. Consider the West Wing. It wasn't even part of the original design. It was added by Theodore Roosevelt to separate the business of the presidency from the family's living quarters. This was a practical change, but it was also a symbolic one. It acknowledged the increasing complexity of the executive branch and the ever-expanding role of the United States on the world stage. The Oval Office, now the most famous office in the world, became the definitive image of presidential power and responsibility. Each administration brings its own unique flavor to the White House, redecorating rooms and hosting events that reflect their personality and priorities. Jacqueline Kennedy's famous restoration project in the early 1960s wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a conscious effort to reclaim the building's rich history, transforming it into a showcase of American art and culture. She wanted every visitor, whether a head of state or a regular citizen on a tour, to feel a connection to the nation's past. She understood that the White House tells a story, and she wanted to make sure that story was told with dignity and pride. This tradition continues today. The White House is where new laws are signed, where heroes are honored with the Medal of Freedom, and where international treaties are negotiated. It's also where the first family lives their daily lives, offering the public a relatable glimpse into the human side of the presidency. We see presidents playing with their children on the South Lawn, hosting Easter egg rolls, and lighting the national Christmas tree. These moments are just as important as the policy decisions, because they reinforce the idea that the leader of the country is also a part of the national family. The legacy started by John Adams in 1800 is a continuous thread running through American history. It's a legacy of leadership, of service, and of the enduring promise of democracy. The White House is the physical embodiment of that promise. It has witnessed wars and peace, prosperity and hardship, division and unity. It has stood as a silent witness to the challenges and triumphs of a nation constantly striving to live up to its founding ideals. From the solemn moments in the Situation Room to the joyous celebrations in the East Room, the building is infused with the spirit of the American experiment. It reminds us that our government is not housed in a distant, inaccessible fortress, but in a home that belongs to all of us. It is the ultimate symbol that in this republic, Leadership is a responsibility passed from one citizen to another, under one remarkable roof. The White House is more than just brick and mortar. It's the beating heart of American democracy, a testament to the resilience of the nation, and a beacon of hope for the future. It stands as a powerful reminder that the story of America is always unfolding. Right, Terry at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. It's a story that belongs to every single one of us. If you found this interesting, please give this video a like and hit that subscribe button to continue exploring the fascinating history that has shaped our world. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a moment of profound reflection as we explore the story of the White House's very first resident, John Adams. It's a tale that encapsulates not just the birth of a nation, but the very soul of the American experiment. Picture this. It's November 1800. John Adams, the second President of the United States, steps into a building that is far from the gleaming icon we know today. The President's House, as it was then called, was a construction site. It was damp, cold, and unfinished. The grand staircase wasn't even built yet, and firewood had to be hauled up temporary ramps. Plaster was still wet on the walls, and a grand total of 6 rooms were barely habitable. Martha Washington's laundry famously hung to dry in the cavernous, incomplete East Room. This wasn't a palace. It was a promise, a work in progress, much like the young nation it was meant to represent. In this raw, unfinished space, Adams' character shines through. Here was a man who had helped forge a revolution, a brilliant lawyer, a diplomat, and now the leader of a fledgling republic. Yet, there was no grandiosity, no demand for royal comfort. Instead, there was a deep sense of humility. He understood that he was merely a temporary steward of this house and this office. He was a tenant, the first in a long line, serving the will of the people. This humility is the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. Idea that power is borrowed, not owned. Adams possessed incredible foresight. Standing amidst the mud and stone, he saw beyond the immediate chaos. He envisioned what this house, and what America, could become. He knew he was laying a foundation, not just of a building, but of a tradition. He was keenly aware that his every action would be scrutinized by history, setting a precedent for all who would follow. He saw the future, not with the certainty of a prophet, but with the hope of a founder. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and disagreements, but he believed in the resilience of the republic he helped create. This foresight was rooted in a powerful faith, not just a religious faith, but a profound faith in the principles of the American Revolution: liberty, justice, and the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves. On his second night in the cold, cavernous house, Adams sat down and wrote a letter to his beloved wife, Abigail. In that letter, he penned a line that would echo through the ages, a prayer that would eventually be carved into the mantelpiece of the state dining room by Franklin D. Roosevelt. That prayer captures the essence of his hopes for the nation. It's a line that resonates with us, even now, a timeless plea that transcends the politics of any single era. He wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Think about the weight of those words. Honest and wise men. It wasn't a call for men of a particular party, or background, or wealth. It was a call for character, for integrity, for wisdom. Adams understood that the strength of the nation would not depend on the grandeur of its buildings, but on the moral compass of its leaders. It was a plea for virtue in public service, a recognition that the republic's survival depended on the integrity of those entrusted with its care. From that unfinished mansion, surrounded by a muddy landscape, the White House grew. It was burned by the British in 1814 and rebuilt from the ashes. It was expanded, renovated, and redecorated by countless administrations. It has witnessed triumphs and tragedies, moments of profound unity and bitter division. It has hosted kings and queens, peacemakers and protesters. The house itself has become a living symbol of the nation's journey, a story of growth, resilience, and constant, often messy, progress. It mirrors America's own story, a project that is never truly finished, always striving to be a more perfect union. And through it all, Adam's prayer endures. It serves as a constant reminder, a standard against which every occupant of that house is measured. It's a challenge to every generation of Americans to demand honesty and wisdom from their leaders, and to cultivate those virtues within themselves. The story of John Adams in the unfinished White House is not just a historical anecdote, it's a foundational lesson. It teaches us that great nations are built not on stone and mortar, but on humility, foresight, and an unwavering faith in the principles that bind us together. As we conclude this chapter, let Adam's prayer be our own reflection. It's a hope for the future, grounded in the wisdom of the past. The house still stands, and the nation endures, carrying with it the echo of that first tenant's humble, powerful wish. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. If you found this story as moving as I do, please give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the moments that shaped our world. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious,